So this is the fourth session, and it's called dealing with critical incidents. Critical incidents is a term used in intercultural studies to describe a encounter between and people from two different cultures where there is some confusion, some misunderstanding, some offence. For example, there's a communication breakdown because they don't share the same references or the same values, for example. This is the plan of the session. We're going to introduce them, we're going to analyse them, we're going to make a link to cultural orientations, which was the topic of the last session, and then the students have the opportunity to apply theory to practice. So introducing critical incidents. So Gerber are a German producer of baby food. When they launched their range in sub-Saharan Africa, their labeling caused shock and confusion. And then we asked the students why. Okay, so they hypothesize why they think this this baby here might cause shock and confusion in sub-Saharan Africa. They point to the fact that it's a white baby, but the actual answer is a little more involved. So in Africa, with high levels of illiteracy, most companies put pictures of what's inside on the label. So basically, the shoppers looked at this labeling, and the suggestion was they were buying pureed baby, which can cause shock, I guess. Here's another one from our culture. Why did from my culture, why did the appearance of members of the Conservative cabinet cause offence when they visited China on a trade delegation in 2010? Okay, so you might need to give some context for the international students among you. So this is Michael Gove. Not sure who this is. George Osborne and the then Prime Minister David Cameron. And you have to draw the students' attention to this, the fact that they're wearing poppies. Okay, so you can let them discover that for themselves. You can give them a nudge. You can give them another nudge by saying what do poppies symbolise for UK people? Of course, it's remembrance of war dead. And then you might ask, what else could the poppy symbolise? Okay, so the answer is that it's a symbol of the opium flower, and during the 19th century, China and the UK entered a series of armed conflicts called the Opium Wars, which resulted in the annexation of Chinese territory, most famously in Hong Kong, which was taken by the British as a trading port. So the background is during the 19th century, lots of Europeans wanted Chinese goods. So lots of silver was flowing into China, and things like porcelain, tea, and silks were being exported. China didn't want anything that the Europeans produced, so that silver, that currency, wasn't circulating and wasn't circulating back. So the British government tried to find something that the Chinese did want, and they hit upon opium from their colony in the subcontinent. So they flooded the country with opium. They made addicts. And of course, the Chinese government objected to this. So there was a series of trade wars, literal trade wars, called the Opium Wars. And this poppy that was being worn by the British was viewed by the Chinese at that time in 2010 as a vivid symbol of China's humiliation at the hands of European powers. So we informed them that they mean a great deal to us, and we would be wearing them all the same, explained a British official, which you can ask the students what they think about the tone of that particular comment. Okay, this image is is sort of a vivid depiction of what China calls the century of humiliation, which went from the Opium Wars about 1840s, I believe, up until the sort of Maoist revolution in China, when they were under the sway and the influence of foreign powers. So you have America, you have Prussia, I believe. This is Austria-Hungary. Sorry, this is France. You have the British, and you have the Japanese also. Just as a kind of postscript to that, you could talk about the dragon too. So the dragon is a symbol which has radically different meanings between, dependent on whether you're a Chinese viewer or a European viewer. In Europe, it's a sign of the devil, basically. It's a serpent-like figure, a sign of Satan. Certainly evil, slayed famously by St. George, and depicted over and over again in artworks, icons, paintings, statues all over Europe. Whereas in China, it's a symbol of power, vitality, good luck. So introducing critical incidents. So in Intercultural, you simply just unpack this for the students. So we're referencing the iceberg here. So what is observed on the surface of the iceberg, the visual depiction of a poppy, can be interpreted in different ways depending on what is perceived to be underneath, the values and the meanings and the symbolism of it. So this conflict is critical since it causes confusion, frustration, shock, or offence. But studying accounts of critical incidents is a great way to develop our intercultural competence. For learning purposes, they are always presented as short descriptions focused only on what can be seen on the surface. So they don't interpret, they don't assign value to any of the interlocutors in the situation. They just give the bare bones description of what's happening, and they encourage us to suspend our own ethnocentric interpretations and judgments, which is a prerequisite to reconstructing the perspective of others. Okay, so we have to see that situation as it's being played out through the eyes of the other people, which involves taking on their cultural lens. Okay, reconstructing their cultural lens. So analysing critical incidents. So your tutor will provide you with an account of a real-life critical incident which commonly occurs at this university. So they have to read the incident, they have to underline any words or phrases which describe the conflict, and they have to give their initial impression of the problem. This will be in pairs or small groups of threes, for example. What could be happening under the cultural iceberg on each side, okay? Think particularly of the orientations, that is the cultural orientations, Hofstede's cultural orientations, which were introduced in the last session. Things like power distance, for example. And also the students should think about a communication style. Now, that's something we touch upon in session 5, but you can just you can mention things like like interruption, the appropriateness of interruption, for example, gestures, for example, gaze, and lastly, they should suggest what could be done to avoid such incidents reoccurring. Now, this is where we go to the handout for this session, session 4 handout, and here are the 3 questions which we've just summarized, and here is the situation. Okay, this is a situation which occurs again and again and again in the Centre for Global Programs. We receive groups of Japanese students throughout the year, and we try to integrate them with York students in class, and this is what often happens. Okay. So the English students dominate the discussion. they lead the discussion. When they ask a question of the Japanese students, the home students do not always wait long enough to hear the answer. The Japanese students, on the other hand, do not at first respond when they're asked a question directly. This causes the English students to repeat themselves or to answer their own question. At the next session, this is describing one particular session. At the next session, both groups of students are visibly frustrated with each other, and group dynamics have broken down to the extent that most York students are no longer attending. So here you have a seminar, cross-cultural seminar, which is a disaster. Okay, so why does this happen? Right. The students in groups, in pairs and groups, try to brainstorm this. They come up with some ideas why this might be happening, and then you can display the. So the next slide. That's the incident again here. This is the slide which we're using to feedback. Okay, so we're looking at what's happening in terms of the assumptions, beliefs, values that from each side of this exchange. Okay, so under the English cultural iceberg, English speakers are uncomfortable with silence and tend to fill it by speaking out. Some English speakers tend to assume that the world speaks their language and that consequently there is no need to adapt their particular version of English. So by their particular version of English, I mean their accent, their dialect, even if it's received pronunciation, that is it's been arbitrarily valued as being a standard, but it's one of countless ways that you can speak English, and because there's a tendency for English speakers to have limited language learning experience, they perhaps do not have that sense of speaking one of many languages, and also the difficulties of receiving messages in a foreign language. Okay, so this is an empathy deficit, if you will. Westerners tend to be more individualistic and therefore more comfortable with giving their personal opinions. Okay, so this is a fact that in individualistic societies, there's a strong tendency to use I. So I think, personally speaking, etc. And there's a tendency for some English speakers to banter or to use language as a competitive display of wit and intelligence. This is quite interesting. So banter is when we're showing how clever we are with words, which often involves breaking rules and speaking very, very quickly also, because it's an indication that you can think quickly. Many cultures have this. So in Black American culture, there's a game called Playing the Dozens, which is a kind of insult game, particularly about the opponent's mother. And the idea is that you win the game if you stay calm, you don't react to the insult, and you come back with an even more barbed and witty comment. Lots of cultures of the world have this, what's called verbal dueling, but it's very, very foreign to Japanese culture, which as a more collectivist society tends to value harmony, as we've seen. So from the Japanese side, for Japanese speakers, silence tends to be interpreted as a sign that one is considering the question carefully and respectfully. Unlike English speakers, Japanese speakers do not use as many or the same kinds of fillers to indicate that thinking time is required. So when we are trying to hold our turn in a conversation, but we need thinking time, for example, we produce sounds like okay, so right, things like that, hesitation devices, as linguists would call them. And Japanese speakers tend to do this less when they are speaking, which can give the impression that they're kind of shut down, for example. Japan is a highly collectivist culture where blurting out one's personal opinion without reference to consensus is problematic. So this is the opposite of what we saw before. And Japanese language has an elaborate system of politeness rituals to harmonize relations and avoid conflict. Again, harmony, consensus is important, and without that obvious strategy of kind of creating consensus, that can be quite a challenging situation for a Japanese speaker to give their personal opinion. Okay, so all that's going on under the surface. So we just have to remind the students now, given what they know, given that they've seen underneath the cultural iceberg a little more clearly, what they could do to avoid such incidents reoccurring. So if they are the facilitator, the tutor in the room, or if they're a particularly proactive student who is participating in the discussion, noticing it's dissatisfactory, knows the reasons why, what would they do to create a more satisfactory conditions for discussion? Okay. Basically, the answer to that would be knowledge of what's happening from the other person's side, how you're coming across, knowledge of the expectations and the assumptions, the kind of worldview of the other person is invaluable, and then it is adaptation, and a lot of patience, I guess. Patience too. Okay, so we're going to move on now. So now we're looking at cultural orientations in critical incidents. What can cultural orientations do? How can cultural orientations help us to kind of navigate critical incidents? Okay, so the critical incident that the students have just seen touched upon individualistic versus collectivist cultures, and it helped us to understand the conflict. So we can use the orientations to map particular kinds of conflict which are commonly encountered. So again, this is a student task now. The students get a table which summarizes the kinds of negative judgments which actors situated within the 8 synthetic cultures can make. Now, remind the students that they've been introduced to 4 cultural orientations, each of which has extreme poles, and that if there was a culture that was situated at the extreme pole with no attributes of the alternative pole, then that's what we call a synthetic culture. It doesn't exist in the real world, but it's a useful thinking and teaching tool. So the students want to complete the table by matching a misperception with an appropriate orientation. So let's just go through this. So this is the next one. So for example, what we've got here is a listener who is culturally more collectivist, or who is situated within this synthetic extreme collectivist culture, would have a strong tendency to misperceive the culture-based behavior of others as selfish, irresponsible, rude, brash, or loud. Okay, so this could be a tendency or a possible negative judgment that would be made by extreme collectivist cultures coming together with extreme individualist cultures. Okay, so let's say Taiwanese coming together with Americans. Okay, the Taiwanese could misperceive the cultural-based behaviour of the Americans as selfish, irresponsible, loud, brash, rude. The students have to do the same for the others. Okay, so it's a simple matching exercise. Here are the misperceptions, A to G, and here are the numbers. Okay, so students do that. They do it individually, then they can pair up and check their answers together, discuss fruitfully any differences, okay, and then you feed back with this slide here. Okay, so let's just take one for example. Low power distance, so something like UK society, or Holland, for example, would have a tendency to view significantly high status cultures like Japan as bossy, rigid, or servile, cowardly, etc. Okay, so here we need to remind the students that what we're using here, what we're applying, are cultural heuristics. These are not stereotypes that we are dealing with, but there are patterns, there are specific kinds of negative judgments which are made of outgroups, and these are very good examples of the kinds of misperceptions that commonly occur. Okay. Okay, so now the students are ready to do 2 critical incidents by themselves, okay, or with their partner or small group. So they've been specially written to illustrate how significant differences in one or more orientations can lead to conflict and misunderstanding, right? Now, there's a procedure for each. It's the same procedure for the last one. They read it, they underline any words which encapsulate the conflict. They have an initial impression of what's going on, which they discuss with their partner or small group. What could be happening under the cultural iceberg? What are the beliefs, assumptions, expectations, values that each each actor has? Okay. Also to think about communication style, okay? So things like tendency to interrupt, tendency to use the word I rather than we, things like this, okay? Once they have their impressions, their initial impressions, they could do some research on the orientation profiles of each country using these resources. So these are the same resources that we looked at in the last lesson, okay? I'll just open both of these up. Okay, so this is Hofstede's country comparison tool, where they can type in, for example, Netherlands, okay, and China, and the other one is the table of countries ranked, okay. For example, okay. So the incidents. Here's the first incident. It's by a young woman from the Netherlands describing German students. Okay, talking about turn-taking behavior. Okay, so this is when we give control to someone in a conversation. So we have a turn, and then we give a turn. So she says, for example, that Dutch students listen to another person and give their comments afterwards in a more gentle form, whereas German students interrupt each other and clearly disagree. Okay. So yeah, so the students do this one as per the instructions. Okay. you have a plenary, you feed back. How you feed back would be you ask the students simply to read the appendix, okay? So the appendix to this worksheet has sort of suggested analyses of what's happening under the cultural iceberg for each critical incident. So, for example, so Germans have higher uncertainty avoidance, which is the truth dimension, pinning down truth, what's correct. For Germans, finding the truth is a very important and desirable thing. In fact, it's so important for them that they are willing to spend their night trying to determine it, and they do not think ill of interrupting each other in a discussion. Okay, so this is from. You can point out to the students that these are from this book, which is a training manual that Hofstede and others wrote in order to help students to understand critical incidents. Okay, there are actually 3 of these incidents, and you may have time to do all 3. You can do 2 of these if you want. They're chosen for a range of cultures. Okay, so German and Dutch. This one here, Thai and English, and this one is US and Kenyan. Okay, so covering a range of cultures here. The last point here is what it's just covered up at the moment, but what transferable lessons can you draw from the incident, and how could you personally avoid repeating the same mistakes? So that's when you're feeding back to the students, you should get their suggestions about this, but it'll mostly be developing your specific knowledge of cultures, being empathetic, being curious, being tolerant, focusing on the objective content of experience and not being quick to interpret what's going on, being adaptable. Okay, so these are the points we want to emphasize. Now, there's a flexi stage to this lesson where students might have their own stories to tell about their own critical incidents. You give them some time to reflect on their own experience of intercultural encounters when they experience confusion or something stronger, and share their accounts with each other and suggest what might have been happening under the cultural iceberg. Okay, so we want for them to describe objectively what happened, not to evaluate and to say, well, they were wrong and whatever. They want to describe objectively and then try to reconstruct the perception, the point of view of the others. Okay, and they can do some research again with the same sources. Has their hypothesis changed after they do the research? Okay, that is the session, and here is the summary of the learning outcomes as usual at the end.